All right, we're going to go ahead and get into the new book for the second book for this course, which focuses on mass shootings with the title of Rampage Nation with the author Louis Klarevas. So let's just jump into that, and we're going to follow the usual format where I have the highlighted points from the chapters and then my commentary. And in particular with this textbook, I want to make an effort to play devil's advocate, to challenge some of his points, and just offer alternatives and competing perspectives. And the reason why I do that is I like the course to to show as many competing perspectives as possible. And Klarevas is not writing an even-handed textbook that shows all the perspectives, and he's not taking that approach. He has a very definite perspective, a very definite take on things, which is fine, which is great. But we want this. The way I like to teach my courses is to kind of show the different sides, and then at the end of the day, let you folks conclude what you find, the type of arguments or perspectives that you find compelling. So having said that, let's pull up the first point here, that Klarevas has basically developed I guess you could call it a theory, or it's a little simpler than that, maybe a model, to try to understand these mass shootings, where he says that there's a convergence of three factors that result in mass killings, which he calls the Trinity of Violence, just to kind of give it a colorful name. And so these three factors, these three elements that need to be present for a mass killing to occur are as follows. You need to have unstable perpetrators, number one. Number two, vulnerable targets. And number three, lethal weapons. So when those three things come together, then you've got a situation where you're going to see a mass killing. So as I studied Klarevas's perspective, I was reminded of a very important theory from criminology called routine activities theory, which takes a similar perspective. And just to remind you folks who've studied this before, maybe some of you haven't heard of this theory says that for a face-to-face crime to occur, like an armed robbery, someone sticks a gun in your face and says, "Give me your valuables," or say a sexual assault, or some other sort of violence, these face-to-face crimes, they won't happen unless you have the convergence of three factors. Number one is you have to have a person who is willing and motivated to commit a crime, who wants to commit a crime, who's interested in that. Number one. Number two is you have to have a victim, a target, whether it be a person or a person's valuables, that the motivated offender is interested in taking, or that maybe the offender has some hatred, a desire for revenge against the victim, and so that victim is a suitable target, as a term is often used. A suitable target meaning it's the kind of target that the criminal has an interest in victimizing. So we'll see that we've seen already in this course that mass shootings oftentimes don't really pick targets with very much precision, that they might kind of shoot up a crowd of people that they have no connection to. And so that's a little bit of a difference between routine activities theory and Klarevas's theory, which is that Klarevas talks about vulnerable targets, that they have to be sort of weak or not able to withstand a mass assault, but the focus is not on the victims having certain characteristics, very specifically, because that's what we see with these mass shootings, is that they're sort of indiscriminate, and they're not a personal beef that the offender has against specific individuals so much. It's more of a general attack. So there's a little bit of a difference there on the issue of the target. And then number three in routine activities theory Um, the crime is not going to happen if there's something sufficient to get in the way of the criminal perpetrating his crime against the victim. So the obvious thing that comes to mind is something like if there was a police officer in the vicinity, could prevent that crime from happening, could break it up, could intervene. Um, you know, so that sort of thing is what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a guardian, somebody who's there who could intervene and stop the crime from happening. But it really could be anything at all, not just people, but technologies that get in between a criminal and a victim. I mean, in this course, we're talking a lot about guns. Well, if the victim has a gun and knows how to use it, that could be a quote unquote a capable guardian, something that comes between the victim and the offender that stops the crime from happening. So you pull out your gun, you brandish your gun, threaten the perpetrator, and he takes off, and the crime doesn't happen. So that's so it can be technologies, it could be people, anything at all that could make it at least more difficult for the criminal to attack the victim. And so that's kind of what Klarevas is getting at when he talks about vulnerable targets. It's targets that are unprotected, that are vulnerable, weak, don't have the power, the strength, the ability to stop the perpetrator, to fight back or prevent the crime through the victim having some sort of ability, capability, power to fight back. So anyway, you can see similarities with this routine activities theory, which again is a very mainstream theory in criminology. Klarevas' approach is something that's not as widely known or studied in criminology, but it's very useful when we're talking about these mass killings. Okay, a violent crime will not happen. This is flowing from the logic of Klarevas' theory. A violent crime will not happen if no one is motivated to hurt other people. So that's one reason why with all of these theories that we go over in criminology courses, we focus a lot on motivation, because it is key. If a person doesn't want to commit a crime and hurt other people, well, it's not going to happen. It won't happen if there are no unprotected victims available if the offenders want to attack. So if you have highly protected victims in one way or another, then you're not going to see these attacks, because the strength of the defense uh, is stronger than the perpetrator's ability to attack. So of course this is kind of a continuum. I mean, it's not always that it's impossible for the offender to attack, but it's kind of a matter of degrees. How difficult is it? And a big concern about people who study mass shootings is this issue of vulnerability of the how soft or hard are the targets. Meaning, hardened targets means you have high security measures are in place to protect these victims, potential victims, whereas a soft target is the same thing as a vulnerable target, where it's just people are sitting ducks, and making it very easy for a person with bad intentions to commit a mass killing. Okay, next point. Okay, now a difference from routine activities theory. Again, we're comparing Klarevas' theory with this routine activities theory. The author stresses that a mass killer needs a weapon to have enough lethal power to hurt multiple people. And I put in parentheses there that throughout the book, Klarevas is treating the firearms as really the type of weapon that is relevant for these mass killings. He, as I write later, he really uses weapons and guns interchangeably, although theoretically speaking, conceptually speaking, those two are not the same thing. We know that mass killings are committed with weapons other than guns, say for example, hitting people with a truck or explosive devices, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly guns are very important here, and that's what Klarevas is focusing on. So that's one thing that routine activities theory doesn't focus on. It assumes that a motivated offender has the capability to harm the victims. So those theorists who developed that theory uh, sort of assume that the criminal, is going to be able to hurt or steal from the victim, and they're not necessarily going to need a weapon to do it. Um, and so they don't really see the weapons issue as essential enough to incorporate it into the theory. So that's a difference between them and Klarevas, as Klarevas really thinks, hey, the weapon here is really important. And it makes a lot of sense for him to do that because most common crimes are a single victim. And so it's not so difficult to overpower or do harm to a single victim, especially if they're vulnerable. But if you're going to do victimize a whole crowd of people, well, that's going to be hard to do unless you have something that gives you lethal power. Doesn't necessarily have to be a gun, but a gun's a pretty good way to do it. So I think it's just a little bit. It's interesting to compare and contrast a little bit these two perspectives and see where they match up and where they're a little bit different from each other. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop at this point, and then we'll pick up. And I'm going to break these coverage of these chapters up into small video segments. So I'll stop here and we'll see you on segment number 2 from chapter 1.